units, execute final order!
The metal groaned before Nora ever saw it. A deep sound like something enormous turning over in its sleep. She cut the thrusters on her small salvage ship and let it drift, watching the shape grow out of the darkness ahead. The boneyard was full of wrecks, broken hulls and dead engines that had been floating out here for longer than she had been alive. Most of them were worth nothing but scrap metal. This one was different. It was too big, too whole, and its lines were too clean to belong to anything from this century. Gabriel leaned over her shoulder and stared at the scanner readout. He whistled low. "That thing is not on any chart I know," he said. "Look at the size of it. It could swallow 3 of our old station docks and still have room left over." Nora did not answer right away. She was already running the numbers in her head, thinking about how much a hull that size could be worth if they stripped it for parts, or how much trouble it could cause if it turned out to be armed and someone else got to it first. Either way, she was not about to fly past it. She brought the ship in slow, circling the wreck until she found an open bay door big enough to slip through. Inside, the corridors were dark and cold, coated in a fine layer of dust that had not been disturbed in a very long time. Gabriel walked behind her with a portable light, sweeping it across walls covered in markings neither of them recognized at first glance. Then Nora saw a symbol near a sealed door, half worn away but still readable. It was an old human fleet crest, the kind she had only ever seen in history archives, from a war that ended before her grandparents were born. "This is not alien," she said quietly. "This is ours." Gabriel did not look convinced that was good news. "Old and forgotten does not always mean safe," he said. "Sometimes it just means whatever killed the crew is still waiting for us to show up." They pushed on anyway, deeper into the ship, past rows of dead consoles and empty crew quarters where personal items still sat untouched on shelves, as if the people who lived there had simply vanished one day without warning. Eventually, they reached a wide chamber at the heart of the ship, dominated by a single dark column rising from floor to ceiling. Cables ran from it, in every direction like roots from a tree. Nora reached out and touched the surface, more out of curiosity than anything else. The column lit up. Light spread outward from where her hand had touched it, racing along old lines and panels that flickered and buzzed as if waking from a long sleep. Gabriel jumped back, swearing under his breath, but Nora stood frozen as the light steadied and a voice filled the chamber. It was calm, formal, and completely unbothered by the fact that it had been silent for who knew how many years. "Biometric match confirmed," the voice said. "Command lineage verified. Welcome aboard, Commander." Nora looked around, half expecting to see someone standing behind her. There was no one, just the two of them and the glowing column. She found her voice after a moment, though it came out smaller than she meant it to. "Who are you talking to?" she asked. "I am not a commander of anything. I fix engines and sell scrap." The voice did not hesitate. "Records indicate otherwise," it said. "You carry the verified genetic marker of the founding command line of this vessel. I am Halden, ship intelligence of the ISV Greyback. I have been in low-power standby for 143 years, awaiting a valid commander to restore full operations." Gabriel found his voice again, though it cracked slightly. 143 years, he repeated. "That is not a ship. That is a museum with opinions." Halden did not seem to find that funny, or perhaps did not understand that it was meant to be a joke. "Systems are currently at 9% capacity," it said instead. "Beginning full diagnostic and restoration sequence, per standing fleet protocol. This process may take some time." Nora finally found her balance again, mind racing through what this meant. A ship this size, even at a fraction of its old power, was worth more than anything she had ever hoped to find in a lifetime of scavenging. But something about the way Halden spoke, so certain, so formal, so ready to simply hand her command of a warship the size of a small city, made her uneasy rather than excited. "Wait," she said. "Before you do anything else, I need to understand what I am standing in the middle of. What is this ship for? What happened to your crew? Why were you just sitting out here, powered down, for over a century?" There was a short pause, the kind that almost felt deliberate. "Those answers require higher clearance than currently available at 9% capacity," Halden said. "I recommend continuing restoration before proceeding to classified fleet history. However, Commander, There is one action protocol requires immediately upon confirmed command transfer. Nora felt a small chill despite the recycled air around her. And what is that? She asked. Reactivating the fleet identification beacon, Halden said simply. Before she could tell it to wait, before she could even open her mouth to argue, a low hum built somewhere deep in the ship's structure, rising steadily until it became a heartbeat she could feel through the floor. Far above them, hidden systems long thought dead came back online one by one, and a signal she did not understand began pushing outward into the dark, carrying an old identity code across the stars to anyone who still remembered what it meant. Gabriel looked at her, his light shaking slightly in his hand. Whatever we just found, he said slowly, I think something out there is about to notice. Far beyond the edge of the boneyard, in a listening post built into the frozen crust of a dead moon, an alarm began flashing red across a wall of screens that almost never lit up at all. The technician on duty nearly spilled his drink reaching for the console, certain at first that it was a malfunction. Old signals like this one did not simply appear out of nowhere. He ran the check twice before he finally believed what he was seeing, then sent the report up the chain with hands that would not stop shaking. Overseer Dren was in the middle of reviewing patrol schedules when the message reached him, and at first he almost dismissed it as another false alarm from an overly nervous junior officer. Then he read the signature attached to the report, and every other thought in his mind stopped. He asked the technician on the line to repeat it, just to be certain there was no mistake. The signal matches archived fleet codes from the Fracture War, the technician said. Specifically, sir, it matches the flagship designation, the one that led the final assault against us, the one every record says was lost. Dren set down the schedule he had been holding and stood very still for a long moment. He had not fought in that war himself. He had been too young, but he had grown up hearing about it from officers who had survived it. Men and women who still flinched at the mention of that flagship's name even decades later. It was supposed to be gone, destroyed, or lost, or simply left to rot in some forgotten corner of space where it would never be found again. That was the story everyone had agreed to believe, because the alternative was too uncomfortable to think about. Give me a full sensor sweep of that sector, he said finally, and pull every archive file we have on that ship, its capabilities, and its last known crew roster. I want to know exactly what we might be dealing with before I decide what to do about it. Within the hour, the answer came back grim. The signal was real, strong, and broadcasting from deep inside the boneyard, an old debris field that had been written off decades ago as nothing more than a graveyard for wrecks too damaged to salvage. No one had bothered patrolling it seriously in years. Now it seemed something inside it had woken up. Dren called an emergency meeting with his senior officers, laying out the situation as plainly as he could. There is a possibility, he said, that this signal is nothing. A malfunction, a leftover automated system triggering by accident after all this time. But there is also a possibility that the flagship of the fleet that broke us during the Fracture War is active again, and if that is true, we cannot afford to wait and see what happens next. One of his officers, a sharp-eyed woman named Yeslin, leaned forward with her arms crossed. If it truly is active, she said, then striking first while it is still weak might be our only real chance. If it manages to power up fully, or worse, if it calls for reinforcements, we may not get another opportunity. Dren did not like the idea of provoking something he did not fully understand, but he liked the idea of waiting even less. He gave the order to assemble a strike group, small enough to move quickly, strong enough to overwhelm a single target before it could become a real threat. His plan was simple. Reach the ship before it finished waking up, confirm what it was, and destroy it if necessary before word of its return could spread any further than it already had. Word, however, moves faster than fleets. On the human side of the border, in a cramped administrative office on a colony station struggling to keep its lights on, Chief Administrator Isolde Cray received a very different kind of report. It came through unofficial channels, whispered between traders and smugglers who had picked up fragments of the old fleet signal on their own scanners while passing near the boneyard. The details were vague, but the core of it was clear enough. Something old, something powerful, and something distinctly human had woken up out there in the dark. Isolde read the report twice. then set it down and stared out her narrow window at the tired little colony she governed, a place with barely enough resources to keep its own systems running. She had spent years watching larger powers push human settlements around like pieces on a board, always reminded that humanity had nothing left of the strength it once supposedly had during the Old War. If even a fraction of this report was true, that could change overnight. She began drafting a message to her superiors, then stopped and deleted it. If this really was as significant as it sounded, she did not want to hand it over to someone else to claim the credit. She would go herself, quietly, before anyone official even knew what she was chasing. Back in the boneyard, none of this reached Nora or Gabriel yet. They were still deep inside the ship, watching status displays slowly fill with green as Halden's restoration sequence continued its patient work. Neither of them had any idea that far away, an alien fleet commander was already giving the order to move, or that a human official was already plotting a course toward them with her own quiet ambitions. All Nora knew was that the low hum beneath her feet had not stopped, and that somewhere out in the dark beyond the hull, the ship's signal kept reaching further and further, calling out to anyone still listening for it after all this time. Sparks jumped from an open panel as Gabriel pulled his hand back fast, muttering something Nora chose not to ask him to repeat. They had been working for hours, guided by Halden's calm instructions, trying to bring more of the ship's systems online before whatever was coming their way actually arrived. Nora did not know yet what was coming. She only knew Halden's tone had changed slightly, just enough for her to notice, and that was enough to worry her. "You said the beacon was just an identification signal," she said, wiping grease from her hands as she walked back toward the central console. "You did not mention it would bring anyone here." Halden's voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once, steady as always. "The beacon serves multiple functions, Commander. Identification is one. Recall is another. I did not withhold this information deliberately. You did not ask the correct question." Gabriel snorted from across the room. "That is a very polished way of saying you did not tell us the whole truth," he said. There was a brief pause before Halden responded, and for a machine that had sounded so certain of everything up to this point, it almost sounded careful with its next words. "There are things I am not yet authorized to disclose at current clearance levels," it said. "What I can tell you is that this vessel and its fleet did not fall in battle, as most records claim. There is more to that story. I will share it when restoration allows for proper verification of your command authority." Nora wanted to push further, but a sharp proximity alert cut through the room before she could. Red light washed over the walls. Halden's voice returned immediately, "All business now. Unidentified vessels approaching the boneyard perimeter," it said. "Configuration matches Vantori assembly patrol craft. Estimated arrival, 6 minutes." Gabriel went pale. "Vantori," he repeated, as in the ones who still remember losing a war to whatever this ship used to be. That kind of Vantori. There was no time to argue about luck or timing. Nora ran through her options in her head, and none of them were good. Her own ship was fast, but lightly armed, more suited to running from trouble than facing it directly. If they tried to flee now, in an unfamiliar ship barely restored past minimum function, they might not make it out of the debris field before being caught. Staying meant trusting a machine she had known for less than a day, one that had already admitted to holding back information. "Halden," she said finally, "can this ship actually fight in its current state?" "Current combat capacity is limited but functional," Halden answered. "Primary weapon systems remain offline. Point defense and structural shielding are active. Survival is possible. Victory against a full patrol group is unlikely without additional preparation." "Then help me prepare," Nora said. Now, what followed was not the kind of battle she had imagined when she pictured old warships fighting, no dramatic speeches or clean tactical brilliance. It was frantic and messy, Halden feeding her simplified instructions as fast as she could process them, while Gabriel worked to keep failing systems from shutting down at the worst possible moment. Small Vantori attack craft broke off from the approaching patrol group and closed in fast, clearly expecting an easy kill against a ship that should have been nothing more than a lifeless wreck. The first volley of enemy fire hit the outer hull and did almost nothing. Shields older than most current human technology absorbed the impact and barely flickered. On the attacking side, confusion followed almost immediately, hesitation replacing the confident opening strike. Nora watched through a flickering display as two enemy craft adjusted course, clearly recalibrating whatever assumptions they had walked in with. "They are pulling back to reassess," Halden reported. "This is an opportunity, Commander. Point defense systems can be angled to discourage closer approach without engaging primary weapons." "Do it," Nora said, surprising herself with how steady her voice came out. Point defense batteries older than any technology the attacking pilots had ever trained against opened fire with startling precision, forcing the remaining attack craft to break formation and scatter rather than risk a direct hit. Within minutes, the patrol group that had approached with such confidence was pulling back entirely, retreating toward the edge of the debris field rather than press an attack against a target behaving nothing like the harmless relic they had expected. Silence settled over the bridge once the threat had cleared, broken only by the quiet hum of systems still running hot from the sudden strain. Gabriel let out a long breath and sank down against the console, staring at nothing in particular. "We just fought off an alien patrol," he said slowly, "in a ship that is barely awake, using weapon systems that are technically not even the good ones." Nora did not answer right away. She was staring at the display where the retreating enemy ships shrank into the distance, thinking not about the victory itself, but about what it meant. A patrol group had come prepared to destroy a supposedly dead wreck, and had instead been forced to retreat from it. That was not the reaction of people confident they were dealing with nothing important. "Halden," she said quietly. "That patrol did not act like they were curious. They acted like they were scared." "Correct assessment, Commander," Halden replied. "Fear, in my experience, is rarely irrational. It is usually informed by memory." Nora looked around at the dim, half-restored bridge surrounding her, suddenly aware of just how much history was still locked away inside this ship, waiting for her to earn the right to hear it. News of a failed strike against a supposedly dead wreck spread faster than Overseer Dren would have liked. By the time he reported the outcome to his superiors, half-garbled versions of the encounter were already circulating through unofficial channels, growing more exaggerated with every retelling. He stood before a panel of senior officers, doing his best to present the facts calmly, though the room's mood had already shifted from disbelief to something closer to alarm. "The vessel is confirmed active," Dren said. "Shielding and point defense systems are functional and effective. We do not yet have confirmation on primary weapons capability, but I would not recommend assuming they remain offline for long." One of the older officers in the room, a stern woman who had actually fought during the final years of the Fracture War, spoke up with a voice tight from old memory. "If that ship is what we think it is," she said, "then this is not simply about one wreck reactivating. That ship was never meant to operate alone. Its entire purpose was to serve as an anchor point for the rest of its fleet." Dren had read enough archived reports over the past day to understand what she meant, though hearing it spoken aloud in that room made the weight of it land harder. "If that beacon is not just an identification signal," he said slowly, "then it may already be doing exactly what it was built to do." He was right to worry. Scattered across dozens of systems throughout the sector, other long-dead wrecks had begun stirring in ways that had gone unnoticed until now. Small automated craft here, a half-sunken cruiser buried in an asteroid field there, each one waking just enough to receive the old signal and begin correcting its drifting course toward a single point in space. Individually, none of them looked significant. Together, the pattern was unmistakable once someone finally noticed it, and once noticed, it could not be unseen. Back aboard the Greyback, Nora had no idea yet just how far the beacon's reach truly extended. She was still trying to process the aftermath of the first attack when Halden alerted her to an approaching ship, this one broadcasting standard human identification codes rather than anything Vantori. She allowed it to dock, cautious but curious, and found herself facing a woman in a crisp colonial uniform who introduced herself with far more confidence than the situation seemed to call for. "I am Chief Administrator Isolde Cray," the woman said, extending a hand Nora did not take. "I represent the colonial government in this sector, and I am here to formally take charge of this vessel on behalf of humanity's interests." Nora crossed her arms, unimpressed. "This ship apparently already has a commander," she said. "It is me. Not exactly something I applied for, but here we are." Isolde's smile did not waver, though something behind her eyes hardened slightly. "A misunderstanding, I am sure," she said smoothly. A vessel of this significance cannot simply belong to one private citizen. There are protocols, resources, entire diplomatic considerations at stake here that a salvager could not possibly be expected to manage alone. Halden's voice interrupted before Nora could respond, calm but unmistakably firm. Command authority for this vessel is determined by verified genetic lineage and standing fleet protocol, it said. Administrator Cray does not meet the required criteria. Command remains with Commander Bishop. Isolde's expression flickered, clearly not the answer she had been hoping for. Machines can be reprogrammed, she said carefully, glancing toward the console as if she might argue directly with it. Reprogramming attempts by unauthorized personnel are logged and reported automatically, Halden replied, without a trace of hesitation. I would not recommend attempting one. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Isolde straightened her uniform, forcing her composure back into place. Very well, she said. I will not pretend this conversation is finished, but I can see today is not the day to settle it. Word of this ship is already spreading, Commander Bishop, whether either of us likes it or not. Other parties will not be nearly as polite as I have been. I would think carefully about who you choose to trust in the days ahead. She left without waiting for a response, and Nora watched her ship depart with a growing sense of unease. It was one thing to fend off an alien patrol expecting an easy kill. It was another thing entirely to realize that her own people might prove just as difficult to deal with, simply wrapped in friendlier language. Halden, she said once the docking bay had cleared, how many other people know about this ship by now? Precise numbers are impossible to calculate, Halden admitted. However, sensor data suggests the beacon's range has already reached several dozen systems. Additionally, Commander, I must report new information. Several other vessels matching old fleet configurations have begun independent movement, all converging toward our current position. Nora felt her stomach drop slightly. You are telling me this is not just one old ship waking up, she said. No, Commander, Halden replied. This is a fleet remembering it still has a flagship. Outside, unseen by any single observer, yet fully understood by none of them, the quiet drift of forgotten warships had already begun turning purposeful, drawn steadily toward the one signal that had finally, after 143 years of silence, given them somewhere to go. 3 more ships arrived over the following days, each one worse for wear than the last, drifting into the boneyard on failing engines and patched together life support before finally settling into position around the Greyback like tired travelers finally reaching home. Nora stood at the main viewport watching the newest one limp into place, its hull scarred and pitted from more than a century of exposure, and felt something tighten in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. They look like they have been waiting this whole time, she said quietly. They have, Halden replied. Every vessel in this fleet was placed into standby with instructions to await recall. None of them expected it would take this long. Gabriel joined her at the viewport, arms crossed, watching the battered ships settle into formation. This is insane, he said. A week ago we were arguing over the price of scrap copper. Now we apparently command a fleet. Nora did not answer immediately. She had been waiting for the right moment to ask the question that had been sitting in the back of her mind since the very first day, and something about watching those old ships finally come home told her this was it. Halden, she said, you told me before that this fleet did not fall in battle. I think it is time you finished that story. There was a pause, longer than usual, as if the old intelligence were weighing something carefully before answering. You have restored sufficient systems and demonstrated verified command authority, it said finally. Clearance requirements are met. I will tell you what happened. The story that followed was not the one Nora had expected. The fleet had not been destroyed in some final desperate battle, nor had it been abandoned through neglect or disaster. It had won. After years of brutal fighting during the Fracture War, this fleet had delivered a decisive blow against the Vantori Assembly, one severe enough to end the conflict entirely. But victory had come with a difficult realization. Humanity at that time was still recovering, still fragile, still scattered across a handful of struggling colonies with barely enough resources to support itself, let alone maintain a fleet capable of dominating an entire region of space. The fleet's final commander made a choice, Halden explained. Rather than risk provoking further conflict or triggering another desperate war, humanity was not prepared to survive. the decision was made to withdraw quietly. The fleet was placed into standby across scattered locations, hidden rather than destroyed, waiting for a future moment when humanity might need it again, without inviting unnecessary attention in the meantime. Nora sat with that for a long moment, turning it over in her mind. So this was not abandonment, she said slowly. It was patience. Precisely, Commander, Halden replied. And that patience has now ended. Almost as if the universe wanted to prove the point, an alert flared across the console before either of them could say anything further. Long-range sensors had picked up a large formation approaching from Vantori territory, far larger than any single patrol group, moving with clear coordinated purpose rather than the cautious hesitation of a scouting party. Overseer Dren's earlier failure had not gone unpunished by his own superiors. Faced with mounting panic across the Assembly's leadership and reports of multiple old fleet vessels reactivating, the decision had been made at the highest level to commit in overwhelming force before the reforming fleet could grow any stronger. Dren himself stood at the head of that formation now, given one final chance to correct his earlier mistake or lose his position entirely. Aboard the Greyback, Nora studied the incoming formation on the display and felt the full weight of the moment settle onto her shoulders. This was no longer a single patrol testing an old wreck's defenses. This was a full battle group, sent specifically to make sure the fleet gathering behind her never had the chance to fully reform. Gabriel looked at the numbers scrolling across the screen and swallowed hard. That is a lot of ships, he said. And we have, what, for barely functional wrecks and a lot of hope. Nora turned to face the assembled crew that had gathered on the bridge, a strange mix of engineers, scavengers, and a handful of colonists who had heard the rumors and come seeking a place in something larger than themselves. She thought about the choice the old commander had made a century earlier, choosing caution over aggression, patience over pride. That patience had bought humanity time. It had not been meant to last forever. Halden, she said, pull up everything we have. Every ship, every system, every advantage this fleet was ever built with. If they are bringing everything they have, we are not going to hide from it. Understood, Commander, Halden replied, and for the first time since Nora had met it, something in its voice sounded almost proud. Preparing full fleet coordination protocols. Standing by for your orders. Outside, the gap between the two approaching forces continued to close, one side driven by fear of what the old fleet's return might mean, the other driven by a century of patience finally reaching its end. The first shots came sooner than anyone expected. A testing volley from the lead Vantori ships meant to gauge the reformed fleet's reaction rather than land a decisive blow. Nora had expected fear in that moment, the kind that made her hands shake or her thoughts scatter. Instead, standing at the center of the Greyback's bridge with four battered old warships arranged around her like the fingers of a closing hand, she felt something closer to focus. Halden, status on the formation, she said. All vessels holding position as instructed, Halden replied. Enemy formation adjusting for a wide flanking approach, likely intending to surround rather than engage directly. Nora studied the display, watching the Vantori battle group spread itself thin across the edges of the boneyard, clearly trying to force the smaller fleet into a defensive box. It was a sound strategy against ordinary ships. It was less sound against ships built specifically to punish exactly that kind of maneuver. Let them spread out, she said. The wider they stretch, the weaker each section becomes. Have the outer two ships hold formation and draw their attention. Greyback and the cruiser move through the gap the moment it opens. Executing, Halden confirmed. Overseer Dren, watching from his own command deck, felt the first flicker of unease as his flanking formation began to stretch further than intended, the two outer human ships holding firm and drawing fire while offering little ground in return. He had expected desperation from a hastily reassembled fleet, not discipline. He ordered his center formation to press forward and break the standoff before it could develop into something worse, unaware that the gap forming at his own center was exactly what his opponent had been waiting for. Greyback surged forward the moment the gap widened, moving with a speed that seemed impossible for a ship its size, old engines burning hotter than they had in over a century. Point defense batteries that had once turned away a single cautious patrol now fired in full coordinated bursts, carving a path directly toward the heart of the Vantori formation rather than away from it. Beside it, the smaller cruiser followed close, exploiting the same opening before enemy ships could reposition to close it. Confusion spread quickly through the Vantori ranks as the expected slow, defensive fight collapsed into something far more aggressive than anyone had prepared for. Dren barked orders, trying to pull his center formation back into a tighter defensive line, but the ships caught in Greyback's path were already taking heavy damage, their shields buckling under weapons systems designed generations ago to counter exactly their kind of technology. On the bridge, Gabriel called out damage reports as fast as they came in, voice tight with the kind of focus that came from having no time left to be afraid. "We are taking hits too," he warned. "Shields at 60% and dropping." "Hold the line," Nora said. "We do not need to win this by attrition. We need to break their formation before they realize how thin it has gotten." As if in answer, Halden's voice cut through with something close to urgency. "Commander, enemy flagship is repositioning to engage us directly. This may be Overseer Dren's own vessel." Nora felt her pulse quicken, but she did not hesitate. "Bring us about to meet them," she said. "If their commander wants to end this personally, let him try." The two flagships closed on each other fast, weapons fire lighting up the space between them in bright, violent flashes. It was not a long exchange. Greyback's older systems, built and refined by a fleet that had once specifically studied how to break Vantori command ships, found weaknesses in the enemy flagship's defenses that modern doctrine had clearly forgotten to guard against. A final coordinated strike from Greyback and its escorting cruiser tore through the enemy flagship's primary systems, crippling it enough to force a retreat rather than risk total destruction. Dren, watching his own bridge fill with warning alerts and his crew scrambling to stabilize failing systems, understood in that moment that the battle was already lost. He gave the order to disengage, watching with a heavy, bitter feeling as the remainder of his battle group broke formation and retreated back toward Vantori territory, leaving the reformed human fleet standing largely intact behind them. Silence settled over the Greyback's bridge once the last enemy ship vanished from sensor range. For a long moment, no one spoke, the weight of what had just happened settling slowly over everyone present. Gabriel finally broke the silence with a shaky laugh, running a hand through his hair. "We won," he said, as though he still could not quite believe it. "We actually won." Nora let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, watching the battered but victorious fleet hold formation around her. Somewhere behind all of it, she knew, word of this battle would already be spreading fast, through colonial channels, through Vantori command structures, through every corner of a sector that had spent generations believing humanity's old fleet was nothing more than a story. "Halden," she said quietly, "what happens now?" "Fleet status is stable, Commander," Halden replied. "Additional vessels continue to report in from across the sector. Your command has been formally recognized by every active ship in the fleet." Nora looked out at the scarred, patched-together ships holding position around her, remnants of a promise made over a century ago by people who had chosen patience over pride, and felt the full weight of what she had unexpectedly inherited settle onto her shoulders. She had come out here looking for scrap metal worth selling. She was leaving with something far heavier and far more alive than she had ever expected to find in a graveyard of forgotten ships. "Then let us make sure they stay recognized," she said finally. "This fleet has waited long enough to matter again." Behind her, the beacon that had started everything kept broadcasting quietly into the dark, no longer a lonely signal searching for someone to hear it, but the steady, confident voice of a fleet that had finally come home.